When you're doing something incredibly difficult, you need to get professional help. Nobody ever decides to go climb Mount Everest and doesn't get a trainer or doesn't train for years before trying to attempt it. But people
Yeah.
decide one
Right.
fine day they're going to become a startup founder, raise millions of dollars from investors, and go through zero professional training on how to deal with that level of pressure and stress. If you go investigate in Southeast Asia, I would say less than 10% of founders have professional help. Finding
Right.
the right professionals to help you is
Right.
also huge because it's impossible to go through that journey alone. And we
Right.
often talk about how a founder's journey is a lonely journey. And therefore, you need the right team of support who are at service to you. It's not your
Right.
investors. It's not your team members. It's not your friends. It's
Right.
professionals who
Right.
know how to train you
Right.
for the challenge you're up against.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 20,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Meet Ringkas, your go-to digital mortgage platform breaking down financial barriers for home seekers across Indonesia and Southeast Asia. They operate in more than 15 cities in partnership with all major Indonesian banks and premier property developers. Ringkas is on a mission to democratize homeownership and create over 100 million new homeowners. Don't just dream about owning a home, make it a reality. Explore more at www.ringkas.co.id. Hey Projjal, excited to have you on the show again. We had a wonderful time recording the first time around, and we've gotten to hang out quite a few times since then, including watching Oppenheimer and Barbie together. But you're also an expert on people leadership, and that's something been a topic that people have been asking over and over again because of both the successes, but also I think the failures in the region. So I thought this is an incredible opportunity to do a deep dive on this. So for those who don't know you yet, could you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's great to be back on the show. So my name is Projjal Ghatak. Since 2020, I've been running a SaaS company called OnLoop, and we really focus on how do we drive high performance for hybrid teams. And prior to starting OnLoop, I'd spent 3.5 years at Uber in a variety of leadership roles, and also where a lot of inspiration came from what I thought worked or didn't work with sort of leadership practices and management practices. And prior to that, I spent some time as a management consultant and in finance. Sort of, I've lived across APAC and the US. I feel like I've not spent enough time in the middle of the world, but I feel like I know both sides of EMEA quite well. And so I feel privileged to be quite global in how I think about things.
So I guess the fundamental question is, what does a good founder slash people leader look like from your definition?
So, I was very lucky to spend 2 years at Stanford Business School. And if you think about what Stanford Business School tries to teach you as a leader, that the
Right,
very first step of it is self-awareness. So before
right,
you even try to understand others, it becomes deeply important to understand yourself. And often I don't think leaders spend that time to really understand who they are, what drives them, what are their superpowers, what are their blind spots. And I think that's the first point. And then that transitions into how you then show up in an organization and how you're able to motivate and inspire and bring the best out of your people. And that can vary based on the state of the business, on the size of the business, on the scale of the business. And so there are different varieties of leadership. We'll talk about peacetime leaders and wartime leaders,
right.
and that's an important distinction. But I think it all starts with an investigation of yourself and really understand what's happening within you. And unfortunately, in my experience, not a lot of leaders spend that time to do that.
Yeah, it feels like you measure them by results, right? And I think every leader also measures themselves by results. So I think it feels like there's a bit of a gap, right? Because you're talking about self-awareness, but leadership is like we say, this person's a great leader because he got a company from zero to X million dollars of revenue. So what do you think about that dichotomy, I
Yeah,
guess? Like, yeah,
it's not a straight path though, right? And actually, Michael
yeah,
Bloomberg, I think, posted this on LinkedIn a day or two earlier that Bloomberg started because at 39, he was fired from his job.
right,
And it was a massive shock to the system. and not something that he had ever expected. And for those 2 months of notice that he had, he worked like an absolute dog to try and prove people otherwise. But it didn't work.
Right.
And that's how Bloomberg started. And so in every leader's story, if someone is a leader for 10, 20, 30 years, it's never really a straight line. And so as a
Right.
leader, you can't really focus a lot on the
Right.
results to
Right.
drive your conduct or your decisions. And that's why
Right.
often we see leaders make mistakes when times are tough and they haven't seen enough. And
Yeah.
I've now had this privilege to be running this company for 3 years, and we've seen quite a bit. And I see the way I react now be very, very different versus when things would go wrong in the first year or two and I didn't really know how to deal with it. And so I don't think leadership should be assessed by results. I think the world often does that. And I think
Right.
people glorify success and put people up on a pedestal. But then they are also often happy to bring them down when they're on that pedestal, as we saw with Oppenheimer and sort of that experience. And so I think leadership's very much about a mindset, and
Right.
and the good leaders stay quite unaffected by the outputs because they know
Right.
that they can't control the outputs. What you can
Right.
control is the inputs, and you have to show up the right way and control the inputs and leave the rest of the world to work itself out.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of Oppenheimer, right? So the movie was there. You and I both watched it. Now that was quite interesting, right? Because, obviously we're talking about building an atomic bomb and so
Yeah.
forth. But I think for me, when I was like watching it, I was thinking to myself, yeah, this guy's by definition, he kind of knocked it out of the park from a results perspective. You take something that's not supposed to be doable to doable within a time frame that people thought
Mhm.
was kind of a Herculean effort, and it worked out in that perspective. A
Mhm.
mixture of luck, the right people, obviously having billions of dollars of Americans' money also really helped in that.
Mhm.
But kudos to him for being that project manager and also being that people recruiter. But I think to myself, like, man, that self-aware leader doesn't really show up well on TV, right? So I
Well,
was just
but
kind of curious. Yeah.
I think leaders also have conviction,
Right.
and that conviction may not always be placed in the right direction, or that
Mm,
conviction may not lead to good outcomes in the world.
right.
But there's
Right.
usually a conviction, and in
Right.
often ways, it's a contrarian conviction of
Right.
a belief of where to take an
Right.
organization or a government or a project. And I think
Right.
what was clear from the movie is that Oppenheimer trusted himself to have the conviction around his
Right.
beliefs. And I think that if you talk to a lot of leaders who've done groundbreaking things, Travis Kalanick included at Uber, there was a lot of conviction. And
Oh,
often the world might disagree with it, and the
oh.
world might revolt against it. But that doesn't necessarily make you a bad leader.
Right. And I think it's interesting, right? Because a good person, if you define it by virtue, is not the same as a strong or effective leader, right? So those are two
Absolutely.
different prisms. And there are many people that you may disagree with on a principles basis, but actually turns out to be still effective leaders and still have some of that lessons, right? For yourself to take away. Or whether you agree with that person's mandate or mission or values even, right?
We should be studying the leaders who are extremely effective at bad causes so that we can
Right.
apply those principles to good
Right.
causes. And the cause, to your point, and the quality of the leadership are completely independent of each other. And unfortunately, we live in a world today where there's a lot of global governmental leaders who are very good leaders, often not for the right causes. And
Right.
therefore, I think we have a responsibility to be demonstrating leadership for good. And the only way we can sort of compete with leadership for bad is by being equally good as leaders, but for the good.
This always reminds me of Harry Potter. There's this class at Hogwarts called Defense Against the Dark Arts. And
Hmm.
then there's always this recurring debate,
Hmm.
which is like, we have a class of defense against the dark arts, but we keep talking about the dark arts in order to understand how to defend against it. So maybe we should just scrap the whole program altogether. And I always thought it was a mildly hilarious, I don't know, it was a recursive argument at some level, but it's a practical class, right?
Yeah, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And so
Yeah.
if you don't understand them, you can't beat them.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting dynamic because that cognitive dissonance.
Mm,
I mean, if I don't like you, I don't want to learn from you. I think that's a
mm,
simple one. So it's easy to learn stuff from people you like, but like you said, there's many people that you don't like, or you respect them obviously, but you don't like
mm,
them, but you still can learn
mm.
from them. Do you have any advice for people to be thoughtful or how to kind of like get past that hurdle to be like, okay, this is something I want to learn?
It's a really good question. And actually, I've seen myself go through this evolution. I am
Right,
much more comfortable today learning things from people I don't like because
right,
I am more secure about myself.
right,
And often when you have that visceral reaction to something where you want to push it away or shove it away, there's something within you that is not certain enough that is
Right.
pushing it away. But today, and as a founder, I come across VC associates often who are not respectful. And just because you're a founder,
Yeah.
they think they can talk a certain way. And before,
Yeah.
I used to get very affected by it because I
Right.
used to feel disrespected. But over time, I figured that was my own insecurity. And if you're more secure about yourself, you can smile at it, take the
Yeah.
pieces you want, not
Yeah.
take the pieces you don't want, and
Yeah.
then move on.
Right.
And so, I think often how the external world affects us, although the trigger might be external, what is
Right.
actually happening is internal. And, Neil was talking about this in your episode with him around when you talk about distractions, only 10% of distractions are because of external triggers. 90% of distractions are about internal triggers.
Yeah.
And which is why I think study of the mind, study of psychology, study of neuroscience is underappreciated in the world that we live in. I think we've lived in a world
Right.
where we've prioritized cognitive abilities and people
Right.
doing math and doing physics and doing computer
Right.
science. But as some of these cognitive tasks get overtaken by machines, and it will
Right.
happen more and more in the next 20, 30 years, I think as human beings, we really need to study ourselves
Yeah.
and then really understand sort of how you work out for your mind to put it in a
Yeah.
place that it can deal with things in a healthy manner, right? People
Right.
go and learn karate and kung
Yeah.
fu and martial arts. We don't learn martial arts for the mind, but the
Right.
mind also requires the right martial arts to defend itself against threat. And when you
Yeah.
feel safe, you're then
Right.
able to absorb. And actually, in the
Yeah.
world today,
Interesting.
we have two powers, US and China, and they
Yeah.
tend to dismiss themselves holistically. I was in China about a month ago, and frankly, I was mind blown. And I was
Right.
mind blown about how well that country runs. And unfortunately, everything you read in the Western press is very negative. And I think China's another example where we may not agree with sort of
Yeah.
the way the country runs, but what that country's been able to achieve is absolutely spectacular. And I think everybody should be studying it to understand more about it.
Yeah, I think it's spot on, which is like we said, it's like martial arts, right? You can be in a highly stressful fight, but if you have done through that practice, you can carry over that state of mind from the practice to the combat. How should founders, for example, practice, get themselves
Mm.
ready? I think you mentioned self-awareness is one thing. And I think you mentioned was like resetting your mindset about the interaction. But how else would you recommend people to be thoughtful about this process?
And when you're doing something incredibly difficult, you need to get professional help, frankly.
Right.
And when I think nobody ever decides to go climb Mount Everest and doesn't get a trainer or doesn't train for years before trying to attempt it. But people
Yeah.
decide one
Right.
fine day they're going to become a startup founder, raise millions of dollars from investors, and go through zero professional training on how to deal with that level of pressure and stress. And I'm
Right.
very proud to say that today I have a coach, I have a
Right.
therapist, and I have a
Right.
psychiatrist. I have all
Yeah.
three, and
Right.
they all play very different roles in
Right.
evolving my mind
Yeah.
to deal with the ups and downs of building a startup.
Right.
And if you go investigate in Southeast Asia, I would say less than 10% of founders have professional help. And I'm massively grateful for the work that my team has done to get me to where I am today. Because 1 year ago, I wasn't in a good place and I sought professional help. That's been a massive game changer. I don't think I would have been here today
Yeah.
if I would have not seek that help. And so finding the right professionals to help you is
Right.
also huge because it's impossible to go through that journey alone. And
Right.
we often talk about how a founder's journey is a lonely journey. And therefore, you need the right team of support who are at service to you. It's not your
Right.
investors. It's not your team members. It's not your friends. It's
Right.
professionals who
Right.
know how to train you
Right.
for the challenge you're up against.
Right. I think for founders, and I was a founder too, right? And I was in a very lonely spot in Boston when I was building my last company. And I think for myself, I engaged an executive coach, a startup coach, and that was very helpful. But I think what I remember especially was before I kind of pulled the trigger, I kept thinking to myself, like, wow, this is really expensive. You're eating like ramen and you're working out of the incubator lab. And then obviously the company starts to take off a little bit. So now you have some money to potentially invest in this. But then it feels expensive. It looks expensive. Your friends don't really talk about it. So I think that was a big hurdle I went through. Did you experience something like that? Or have you heard of that concern from other founders?
I mean, to be honest, it took me 2 years before I decided to pull the trigger. And a big part was that belief that is this a worthwhile investment to invest in myself?
Right.
But if you get a coach doing 2 sessions a month for 90 minutes a month, it's going to cost you, if you get a really, really expensive coach is going to cost you between $2,000 and $4,000. And you would hire an SDR in the Philippines in a heartbeat for $2,000 to $4,000.
That's a
And
wild way to put it. Yeah.
but if you think about the enhanced productivity you can have in terms of your productive capacity, in your
Yeah.
ability to connect dots, in your
Right.
ability to stay calm in adversity, in your
Right.
ability to inspire effectively, the ROI on that is huge. I think
100%.
what people struggle with people
Mm.
stuff, and I know we'll get into it, is that it's hard to measure. And when
Mm.
something is hard to measure, people invest not the right amounts because
Yeah.
you can't see the ROI. So people will
Right.
invest a lot more in a CRM system because that translates into dollars and cents in revenue. And so
Right.
you can see and feel that much more clearly. But
Right.
the impact that an executive coach might have on you or a system like ours might have on you is harder to quantify. And there's actually lots of learning from the fitness industry, and we
Right.
can talk about that too. But I
Right.
think it's important to talk to other founders and understand
Right.
what drives it. And one of the worst things people do is when they're in crisis, they get a coach. And that's the worst time to get a
Yeah.
coach. Because by then, sometimes it's too late, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you,
Yeah. Yeah.
you go for your annual health checkup. That's much better than being at stage 4 cancer, right?
All
And
right.
so I think it's very much an education process. I know that there are investors paying at Monk's Hill who really understands people leadership
Right.
well. And I know he counsels founders the right way. And so for
Right.
us in Singapore and Southeast Asia, it's really about the ecosystem sort of maturing. I would say that in Silicon Valley, you would see a larger percentage of founders getting coaches,
Right.
and it's just a more mature ecosystem. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the other thing to be said is that there are a lot of bad coaches, and that is also a thing. And
Yeah.
part of the reason why I started coaching a few CEOs is because I felt like you can't coach a CEO if you've never been a CEO. And there's not a lot of VC-backed CEOs coaching CEOs in Southeast Asia. Versus if you look at the coaches in the Valley, they're often retired. In fact, Bill Campbell, who used to coach some of the best leaders in Silicon Valley, used to do it for free once he
Yeah.
retired. And so it wasn't really a
Yeah.
profession. We don't have
Yeah.
that luxury in Southeast Asia yet, but hopefully in 5 or 10 years, we'll build out an ecosystem that's very good.
There's a lot of different ways we can take this conversation. For me, first of all, I 100% agree with you about ROI. Your company's growth is a function of your team's growth, and your team's growth is a function of the leadership growth, and the leadership growth is a function of your personal growth, right? So I think the rate limiter of everything is actually the CEOs. So there's a tremendous amount of ROI. But I want to double click on what you said, which is that it's hard to measure. So how do you measure? How do you make the case for yourself to your board that you want this coach? How do you make this case first?
Yeah, to be honest, for me, and I'm actually a clinical anxiety patient, and I'm now under both psychological and psychiatric care for anxiety. But I saw my productive capacity massively decline. And so
Mm,
my ability to deal with problems was
right.
greatly hindered. And
Right.
I couldn't put in the time and the effort that
Mm,
it takes to
right.
effectively run a startup. And so for me, what I realized is that I was operating at 50% of my normal productive capacity. And I could then feel the difference when somebody came
Right.
up with a problem on how I reacted. And today, even though I sleep lesser and I probably work more, when a problem
Right.
comes at me, I'm excited because I'm excited to solve them because most founders inherently are problem solvers. And so,
Right.
and I've spent many years of my life being a problem solver in companies. And so for me, that was sort of the trigger when I felt that there was a very direct impact
Yeah.
on
Right.
my productive capacity and my ability to deal with problems. Obviously, we do that in product form. And if you want to, we can talk about that. And so what we're trying to productionize is giving a clarity score for every team member in terms of
Right.
what's happening with their wellness, what's happening with their goals, what's happening with their feedback. And the
Right.
clarity score looks very much like a readiness
Mm,
score on a Aura ring or a recovery score on a Whoop band, and then gives you insights into what actions you can take to enhance your clarity. And
right.
depending where things are broken, and that might be with someone's productive capacity or well-being, or it might be they don't have clarity around their goals, or they don't understand what they're really good at, and there's a hierarchy there on what to investigate, that can then enhance the clarity of the person. And so I
Right.
think about the word clarity a lot.
Right.
And how in a hybrid world also clarity is harder because
Mm,
often you investigate clarity by spending time with your team members, and that's something
right.
we don't have the luxury of in the same way
Right.
versus in a pre-COVID world. And
Right.
teams that are clear produce better results, they are
Right.
happier, they are more productive, they don't burn
Mm,
out and achieve
right.
business outcomes. And you can
Right.
start drawing that link between the health of you, the health of your team, and how
Right.
that translates into achieving results. And that's our reason for existence. And that's why we think a lot about how do you measure things effectively? Because if you can't measure them, it's very hard to make them better.
And I think that's a great way to tie off the bit about how to make the business case. But I want to double click on what you also said, which is there are many bad coaches. So what's the difference between a good coach and a bad coach, and how do you tell the difference?
Yeah. I think one of the ways I put it is that I don't think there's any tennis player in the world who has a badminton coach, right?
Hmm.
I strongly believe that you cannot coach someone for a role if you have
Right.
not at least played the same sport. And the sport of a founder CEO is
Yeah.
very different from that of a mid-level executive at a corporation.
Right.
And there are many people living mid-level corporation jobs and becoming coaches and
Right.
then aspiring to coach founder CEOs. They can be very
Right.
good coaches for mid-level managers, but they
Right.
wouldn't be great coaches for founder CEOs. So for me, first is, do you have personal empathy and do you have personal experience with the sport that's getting played? And sure, if you can maybe be a triathlon coach, if you've been a swimming and cycling and running coach at different times, it doesn't have to be exactly the same,
Right.
but you
Right.
have to have strong empathy. That's one. The second is that people often confuse between what is a coach and what is a
Right.
mentor or an advisor. And the biggest difference there is, as a coach, you have to be deeply listening to be in ask orientation versus
Yeah.
in tell orientation. Because
Mm.
the goal of a coach is
Mm.
realizing that for every individual, the answers are inside them. And it's your job to then investigate to get them to the answer, because when someone comes up with the answer themselves, they are much more likely to implement that
Mm.
versus advice they're receiving or being told to do.
Right.
Especially
Right.
people like founders who have strong self conviction
Right.
about what they're doing. And then three, ideally, they should have received some sort of formal training. So I was
Right.
lucky that when I did my MBA, I did a 1 year program called the Arbuckle Leadership Fellows Program, where as a
Right.
second year MBA, you coach both in a group and individually 9 first year MBAs. And then you go through a very structured program on how to learn. And that's really the basis of sort of my experience getting trained. People talk about certifications. I have mixed reviews about certifications and how good a job they do at making someone
Mm.
a coach. But I think
Right.
the two biggest is, have you played the sport? And
Right.
do you have the patience and listening ability to largely stay in an ask orientation versus a tell orientation when you're coaching someone?
No, that's super interesting. I love the part about ask versus tell. I remember I was backpacking in Peru and Bolivia as a student, and I was on a bus, and there was this Israeli guy, and I was like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I'm full of optimism. This guy's a middle-aged guy, and he's like, "Jeremy, I'm here to find myself." And I was so confused because I was like, I mean, you're here, right? Why are you in Peru and Bolivia finding yourself? It's funny because I kind of understood what I was saying, but it took me so many years because I was like, yeah, the joke is that
Mm,
he's with himself the entire time round. So he's just traveling around the world.
mm.
And obviously, I think having a new environment and travel lets him obviously explore new frontiers. I'm just sharing this story because, not because it's bad, I think travel really helps unlock new ways to see yourself. So it's not about that. But it's more like I still remember I was just thinking to myself, like, you're already here, right? And so I think there's an interesting dynamic about what
Yeah.
you said, finding yourself. That self work is hard.
I think people often use finding yourself in the wrong way. I think in many
Right.
ways, what they're trying to say is what makes them feel alive. It is unfortunate that there are a
Right.
lot of people zombieing their way through life and not really understanding what really makes them feel alive to better structure their days. And I know that sounds like a humongous privilege
Right.
because there are people who just have to do what they need to do to pay the bills. Those people unfortunately don't have the luxury to
Right.
select that. But when people talk about finding your passion or find your calling, I think it's too abstract. I think
Right.
it's very much about, what does your everyday look like, whereby at least 50% of your hours are spent doing things that energize you and make you
Right.
feel alive. And that's a much more
Ooh.
tangible way of thinking about, let's say, finding yourself. But unfortunately, I think I talk about this a lot. People often solve symptoms because
Right.
they don't understand the root cause of the disease. And some
Right.
people call it first principles thinking. But as we know, that's rare in the world. But it's really about energy. And I love high quality conversation. And that's my drug. And
Yeah.
if I spend 12, 14 hours a day having high quality conversations, I'm never going to be burnt out. But
Yeah.
you make me a process engineer for 4 hours a day, I guarantee you I'll burn out in 2 months. And so burnout also has no
Yeah.
association with how hard someone is
Right.
working. That's the other thing that really
Right.
frustrates me around the modern literature, that people associate overwork with burnout. Overwork might make you fatigued, it
Right.
might make you tired, but it's not going to make you apathetic, which is what burnout is. And so, in a world, because producing content is cheap and easy, and AI will make it even cheaper and easier, there's a lot of content out there.
Yeah.
And not a lot of the content really investigates
Right.
to actually what's going on versus provide lip service to buzzwords that people like and will read.
That's a really fascinating dynamic here because it reminds me of like I was reading this article about the medicalization of grief.
Mm,
So obviously there is depression, that's a real symptom, but obviously grief very much feels like depression because you're grieving the loss of someone. And then I think there's a very big debate, which is like, how long is grief supposed to last for? Because if it's
mm,
too long, we should give it a pill. And I thought it was a fascinating, obviously, article, but I think it was that medicalization of what is
mm,
normal versus abnormal.
mm.
I think burnout also goes through that definitional debate, which is like, it kind of goes back to what we said, finding yourself, right? It's definitional. The wrong definition can lead to the wrong question, which leads to the wrong search for the answer.
No, absolutely. And I think often it is
Yeah.
things at a surface level versus
Right.
2 or 3 or 4 levels down in terms of
Right.
investigation, in terms of
Right.
what is the root cause. So if your revenue is not growing as a company, you're not
Right.
going to solve your revenue problem by thinking about revenue. So you have to break down that
Yeah.
revenue to its very constituent parts into
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
right input metrics to understand why that
Yeah.
revenue is not growing.
Right.
But
Right.
often there are CEOs freaking out about revenue is not growing, revenue needs to grow, but that's not going to solve anything. And that anxiety is not going to
Yeah.
solve anything either. You just have to very
Right.
logically and calmly investigate things
Right.
to understand
Yeah.
what's really going on. In a world where we live for instant gratification and we live for the proverbial dopamine hit, I think in many ways we have a thinking crisis in the world where
Right.
we aren't thinking deeply enough about things.
Right.
And if you don't think deeply enough, we'll be solving the wrong things.
Yeah, I was chatting with a Vietnamese founder in Education Tech just a few weeks ago, and we were just discussing about how the investors kept asking about his financial metrics, and he kept talking about his product metrics. And then I kind of said exactly what you said. I was like, all the investors are measuring the cow by how much milk it makes, but doesn't really care whether the cow is healthy or not. And so I think there's that language, but also the financialization of what a good company is. And I
Yeah.
think that's something that investors play a part in contributing to that thinking as well.
Which is why founder investor fit is huge. One of the things I got very lucky with
Yeah.
is I have investors who fully understand why I do the things I do, even
Right.
if it may not be beneficial in the 3 to 6 months time frame, and understanding what is the longer arc here that we want to follow. And often the distinction I make, unfortunately, in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of people who call themselves venture capitalists, but what they really are is small, middle enterprise private equity, the SME PE. And they're trying to get a 2 to 3x return on every investment.
Right.
That's what they're trying
Right.
to do. So they're trying to identify an investment that will 3x in 3 years and not lose
Right.
money. That's a different
Right.
asset class. And I'm not saying
Right.
that's a bad asset class, but
Right.
it's a different asset class. And venture capital is very much about asymmetric outcomes. But when ecosystems are young and VC is a well established concept to call yourself. There's a lot of people calling
Right.
themselves VC when they're not VC. And actually, I met someone recently who really understands the distinction. He was very honest and said, the reason why we focus on B2B is that we see ourselves as SME PE and
Right.
we want our investments to be returning 2 to 5x consistently. And I'm like, that's great. And ecosystems require all kinds of capital. But often,
Right.
as a founder, if you have a longer term vision of what you want to build and what you want to disrupt, if you don't have the right investors, you might end up hating working for your own company. And that is just a massive curse. And so I really feel like I got lucky and feel incredibly aligned with the way I think about the world and my investors do. And we may not always agree. We fight in every board meeting, and that's good. There should be healthy trade-offs into why we're doing what we're doing, but they tend to sort of see my point of view once I'm able to explain it.
Yeah, I think that's super frank. I think I was just discussing that over lunch today, actually.
Mm.
It was just the conversation was really fundamentally, are we looking, part of it is because Southeast Asia, there's a frontier market. So people are just thinking about what was a, like you call it, SME private equity versus a VC outcome, I think that was not very clear 5 to
Mm,
10 years ago when a lot
mm,
of funds were being raised and a lot
mm.
of commitments were made to LPs about a strategy. But yeah, I think now we're starting to see that, I wouldn't say bifurcation, but a little bit more clarity about those two different dynamics. And it's not wrong for a VC to have some, like I said, 3 to 5x outcomes. But the question is, are you clear that this is the investment and that this is the best way, like you said, to nurture it across the board meetings, right? Because
Yes,
that strategy misalignment at a board level can really destroy a lot of value
absolutely.
for both sides if you're not clear about it. Whereas if you're clear about it to yourself,
Yeah,
you're clear about it to the founder,
yeah.
then it's like, woo, okay, it's
And which is why 2020 and 2021 was backwards for the ecosystem in many ways,
mm,
right? Because
yeah,
it
yeah,
brought in a lot more constituents to the ecosystem that just had a shallower understanding of things because it felt like
right,
a get rich quick scheme. And the reality is
right,
that venture capital is not a get rich quick scheme either for the venture capitalist or for the founder. And I
yeah,
tell people
100%,
being a founder is the worst financial decision you can ever
right,
make. If it's about risk adjusted return, don't do it. And unless there is a particular mission that you're somewhat obsessive about, it's just not worth it. It's
right,
not worth going on the fact. And that doesn't apply to opening a small business, doesn't apply to opening a restaurant. But if you're going to go on and take on massive industries and be a true disruptor and build something really net new, that's
mm,
very hard. And it's going
right,
to take a very long time and it's going
right,
to take a lot of sacrifice. And
well,
unfortunately, I don't think a lot of founders fully realize
right,
that. And which is why when things get tough, you see people freaking out, you see people doing stupid things that hurt their reputation, you see people getting vindictive to the other side. And it's really unfortunate. And it then hurts
right,
other founders because it increases the level of suspicion about everybody else in the ecosystem. So every founder who embezzles money is doing a massive disservice to every other founder because
yeah.
now just the trust level goes down. And the VC founder relationship in how it should operate is one that's built on very high trust. And if we change that, it's just going to hurt everybody.
Yeah, I think there's a fine distinction. Well, it's not a fine distinction at all. I think there's a big difference between founders who fail
Yeah.
and founders who are doing criminal activity. I think there's a big difference. But I think where it feels fine is like that moment. I think both have that high stakes dynamic to it, right? So everyone's like
Mm,
high stakes, high stakes, high stakes.
mm,
And I also understand that sometimes if you're building service, there's no regulation, there's no, what's the word, norms around it. So I can imagine I mean, you had Uber, I think Uber obviously had that a dynamic where it was entering markets that didn't have regulations to support
mhm,
car riding. So I
mhm,
think but I think when there's a fiduciary duty and you're in breach of it,
mhm.
I think it's something very different, right? And I think that's a shame. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happens is nobody ever goes and commits large crimes overnight. What happens is you do something small, which feels
Right.
insignificant. And then you
Right.
do a second thing to cover up that first thing. And then you do a third thing to cover up that second thing. And then over time, that ends up being pretty egregious. And so one of the things that I've got very comfortable around is that
Right.
in months where revenue growth is zero, just tell your investors revenue growth is zero. Don't change the answer. And yeah, you will get 4 emails where they will not be happy,
Right.
but they will move on and then it will
Well,
go back to where it is. But
right.
if you're like, oh my God, what are they going to say? Are they going to lose respect for me? Are they going to think I'm useless? That's when that fear and that insecurity makes you start doing things wrong. Because ultimately, for every bad act that happens that's a crime, underlying it is some shame or some
Yeah.
fear.
Right.
And the intention is to self-protect and sort of not give in to that fear or the shame. And which is why, like, going back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation, a lot of it goes back to building up your own self-certainty and
Right.
realizing that no matter what the outcome, people will respect you, people will give you another opportunity, people will invest in you again, as long as you don't do bad things. But a
Yeah.
lot of people think they may not get a second chance. This is their last shot. They've got to make whatever they can of it. And it is that anxiety and that fear and that shame that leads to bad outcomes. And I've been reading and listening and learning a lot about what makes narcissistic people what they are. And if you look at what sits at the bottom of it, it is deep shame. And
Mm,
the only way to change that is to cure that shame. But, going back to what we were talking about, often we just see the surface activity and we judge it versus
right.
being curious about what's really happening beneath the surface. We fail to investigate what's going down deeper.
Right.
And often you realize that there's deep vulnerability there
Right.
that needs to be
Right.
fixed. And so bad behavior can be changed if we understand what leads to that bad behavior.
Yeah. I think that's the awkward reality, which is that when you choose to be a founder, you're not doing this out of pure virtue to save the world. You're also doing this because you want to. For myself, I was ambitious, I was hungry, I wanted to challenge myself, I saw an opportunity, so I was opportunistic. So I think there's all these different internal factors that said this is something I think is doable, and I want to be the person that does it.
No, absolutely. And I think that, but I strongly believe I'm a very old school founder. And so I believe that if you do not believe in the mission, there are
Right.
many other ways to be ambitious and do really well. I think big tech has made a lot of people really wealthy, and it's actually a much safer career path. You can join Meta and work on products that impact billions of lives
Yeah,
and
100%.
make impact too. But the stakes are very different when you are the person. And no
Right.
matter how big or small the org is, the buck stops with you. And that is incredibly stressful with a 2-person org or a 50-person org if there's no one above you. But if there are
Right.
people above you, then it's very different, which is why I think every CEO needs a coach, because actually everyone wants a manager and everybody has a manager except a CEO.
To wrap things up, is there any piece of advice that you feel is perhaps underappreciated or that you often share with the people that you coach or that come to you for advice?
Yeah, I think that often people want to solve business results. So they're very, very focused on let's solve business results. And often when I take on a client, I'll really understand that person's well-being and their productive capacity before we talk about anything in the business. And because we are all ambitious, because we're all results driven, myself included, when revenue doesn't grow, it's stressful. But I have to take a step back and think about what sits at the base of it, because when times are tough, that's when I need to be at my very best to solve problems. And that means I need to take care of my ability to think versus do. And often when a founder comes from an employment, like when I came from Uber, I was much busy doing at Uber. And that was a big part of my job. But a big part of being a founder is to think. And some of the best insights come when you're doing nothing, but you're still working. You're thinking about what you're doing. But sometimes founders feel like, oh my God, they have to work all the time. They have to be in a gazillion meetings and be working on things till 4 in the morning. But if you don't give yourself time to think, you will probably hurt your business more versus giving yourself the ability to come up with original or unique insight that will take the business forward.
Right. Yeah. And on my end, I think one thing I often share is a framework which is called outside in versus inside out. So what I mean by that is sometimes we're talking about something and the person is like, I need to do this because the market is this, and this is the best product launch and so forth. And I'll be like, okay, there's a certain cause and effect. The market needs it, therefore the company needs to do it, therefore I need to change, right? And I would say this is an outside in, which is the outside environment is telling us we need to do something but inside. And I'm not saying that we don't discount that, but let's look at the other way around, which is inside out. What does the inner core of you want to do? Therefore, what does the company want to do? Therefore, how does it change the environment, right? And I think that inversion of cause and effect to some extent at least lets people understand that what, for example, you mentioned strengths. There could be a strengths perspective versus, like you said, what does the environment want? And it's not to say one is better than the other, but at least we know that there are two different ways to approach it. And I think that can actually unlock quite a healthy conversation about the
No,
trade-offs
and that's,
needed.
people talk about product management, and often product management is listening to the problems, but not listening to the solutions. And that solution needs to come from within, or else you won't be able to authentically defend it to get it to the depth of insight for it to win in the market.
100%. Yeah. On that note, I'd love to kind of like summarize the three big key takeaways I got from this conversation. First of all, I love what you shared about what is the value of coaching? What's the value of good leadership? What does good leadership look like? I thought that was tremendous because I think we had this very honest conversation about how you and I both ended up engaging executive coaches, for example, because we needed help, but both of us felt it was too expensive. It took us years to both pull the trigger. I think there is a structured way to approach the business case, that there is value, that is actually highly cost effective, there's high ROI at the end of the day, as long as you're being intentional about the fact that you as a leader are making a lot of decisions on behalf of the organization, right? So I thought it was really important. The second thing I really enjoyed actually was a little bit about, I think to some extent, the ecosystem about private equity versus VC. What does good leadership look like? What does a good board look like? What a healthy debate looks like. I think that's all very constructive. And I thought it was a frankness about there needs to be self-awareness by the founder about what the best growth path is, but also self-awareness by investors about what the company actually is and what the growth trajectory is. And I think that was a really good call to action for more self-awareness by all parties in the Southeast Asia ecosystem. The last thing I really enjoyed was perspective on what good coaching looks like. I thought it's not easy because we all want to say all coaches are great, but we also know that's not possible. But I love your perspective that you have to play the same sport in order to be a great coach. I think use the example of tennis versus badminton are two totally different sports. So I think I agree with you. But also I think what's important was also you added other stuff that makes it very hard, which is that you have to be someone who's willing to ask and be patient rather than tell, and that you actually want to do it. And I think that's why there's such a shortage of coaches. So on that note, please go hit up for coaching. I don't know how many more people can accept your book, but can you share with how people can reach out to you or OnLoop?
LinkedIn's the best. And so I'm Projjal. I also have a PJ in my name now in case Projjal's too hard to remember. So you can either look for Projjal or PJ and find me. And there's only one OnLoop as far as I know. And so please reach out on LinkedIn. I'll be very happy to chat with anybody that we can help.
Awesome. On that note, thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
No, thank you, Jeremy. This was actually a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.